When we started our project using the API template, we noticed that a controller was automatically added, the weather forecast controller. I deleted it because it's just an example controller, but this does beg the question, what's that controller thing all about? Well, that has to do with a pattern that's used to build APIs in ASP.NET Core, namely the MVC pattern, which stands for Model View Controller. You may have heard from it or encountered it before. It's a very common architectural software pattern implemented in many languages and frameworks. The same pattern, by the way, is used to build client-facing web apps with ASP.NET Core. MVC, as mentioned, stands for Model View Controller. Looking at the definition, it's an architectural software pattern for implementing user interfaces. There's some confusion on what it exactly is, and thus because different interpretations on what it should be exist. Essentially though, it's meant to encourage loose coupling and separation of concerns, which in turn allows better testability of your application and the ability to reuse parts of it. Mind you, it's not a full application architecture. In a typical N-tier architecture, MVC is used in the presentation layer, and that's about it. Hence the implementing user interfaces part of the definition. If you've ever worked with Angular, well, you could sort of regard that as a client-side MVC implementation. It consists of 3 parts. The model handles the logic for your application data. A model in this sense can contain code to retrieve or store data at that level. In some implementations, often when the MVC pattern is only used at the top level of your architecture, the model doesn't contain any logic at all. It's another component of your app that handles this. For example, a business layer. In other implementations, a view model, which does contain code to retrieve or store data, is in fact used as the model. The view represents the parts of the application that handles displaying data. This might be HTML. And the controller then handles the interaction between the view and the model, including handling user input. If we look at the dependencies between these components, we see that both controller and view depend on the model, and the controller also depends on the view. That is one of the key benefits of this separation. In other words, the controller chooses the view to display to the user and provides it with any model data it requires. But with all this talk about user interfaces, how does this map to building an API? Well, that view in API terminology is the representation of our data or resources. More often than not these days, that's JSON. And user interaction, well, the user or consumer of the API would typically be another application. So when a request is made by an API consumer, an action on the controller will be triggered. The controller sends any input data, like query string parameters for example, to the part of the application responsible for business or data access logic, and it returns a model to the view. That view in this case doesn't contain any logic like a Razor or HTML-based view, including some JavaScript might have, but it is a representation, in JSON for example, of the returned data. And with that, it's time for a demo.